And also Orient was the, you know, um, source of all spices in the world. And trading with the East had always been very profitable to the Europeans, to the Westerners. So they were really anxious to find a sea route to the Orient. And Vasco da Gama became successful in discovering a sea route to the East, to the Eastern countries. And at the same time, I told you, they continued to cherish those, fantasy ideas about the Orient. Even now, they had so many misconceptions about the Orient. And then, even now, there are some people in the Western countries who think that one can see wild animals in our streets, like tigers and lions, and we are actually passing through. And so to them, this is a land of snake charmers, magicians, the street, circus. And then this is a highly exotic land because, this is a land full of, exotic women and the like. So those ideas could be called Orientalism. And also they had created several stereotypes of the Orient. Several stereotypes of the Orient. Like the Orient is timeless. So that is a stereotype. The Orient is timeless. What does it suggest? Orient is timeless because time is rather stagnant in the Orient. So they think that, the Westerners think that their countries, the West is always dynamic, progressive and progressing day by day. It's dynamic, highly dynamic, ever changing. But the Orient is rather stagnant. The Orient is rather stagnant. No development at all in the Oriental countries. And several Westerners think that the Orientals are ancient people, untouched by scientific progress, and untouched by developments. And there is a recently developed theory called the tourism studies, or tourism studies or post-tourism. And so here they think that a Western tourist visiting India hopes to find in India what his country was like 100 years ago. What his country was like 100 years ago. See, his travel is not only through space but through time as well. This is what they think. He hopes to find in India and other Eastern countries what his country was like 100 years ago. Because time is rather stagnant here, and his country is always progressing, and ever changing, dynamic. And another concept of another, a stereotype of the Orient is that the Orient is rather effeminate, weak, while they are strong and powerful. The Orient is effeminate, is weak. And also they had several assumptions about the Oriental race. some prejudices about the Oriental race, like murderous Arabs. Murderous Arabs. Arabs are murderous. A murder tribe. A murderous. They are murderous. And the Indians, they are lazy people, lazy Indians. And the Chinese, very cunning, cunning Chinese. So these are their stereotypes about the Oriental race. And they had such prejudices about, they have such prejudices about the Oriental people, Oriental race. And then another is their stereotypes of the Oriental gender, Oriental, gender, stereotypes of gender. They believe that, several Westerners believe that the Oriental women are exotically sexual. And they are moving around in scantily dressed way. They are scantily dressed with little clothes on their body. And they are very experts in, sexual acts. Whereas the Oriental male are rather too effeminate and impotent. This is what they, think about the Oriental gender. The, women are exotically sexual, skillful in sexual acts, whereas the men are, rather effeminate and impotent. So there is another stereotype about the Oriental. And again, another thing is that the Orient is always, strange and bizarre. That is like, as I have told you, one can see, street, charmers, the street circus, snake charmers, and the like. So this, they have so many such, misconceptions about the Orientals, and all these things can be put together under the title, under the word Orientalism. So this is what is called Orientalism. The Westerners' preconceived notions, prejudices, misconceptions about the Orient. So that's what's called Orientalism. This is Edward Said. And now let us, discuss that topic, Orientalism, or introduction to Orientalism. This first part of the introduction. So it starts with the description of Orientalism. And in the Western countries, in the European countries, the idea of the Orient was first introduced by writers like Chateaubriand and Nerval, the French writers Chateaubriand and Nerval. And so they gave so many, elements of fantasy in their writings of the Orient. And thus, the Orient became a European invention. Orient became a European invention. And so, because they think that it is a place of antiquity, it is a place of romance, it is a place of exotic beings, and it is a place of haunting memories and landscapes and remarkable experiences. So this is what the Oriental, this is what the Western people, the Occidental people thought about the Oriental. But now that all such things are disappearing because of better communication and because of better travel facilities and the like. And so this idea of Orientalism was much, much developed by the French and the British. The French and the British. It is the French and the British people who, contributed much to this discourse on Orientalism, and not Americans, but less so the Germans, Russians, Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, and the Swiss. So they all have actually, uh, done, several, things to Orientalism, but it was the French and the British people who contributed much. And so thus Orient became, a point, a place of reference in European or Western experience. So that's the idea of the Orient was first, um, introduced in the West by Chateaubriand and Noel. And so this it was definitely European invention. And it was the British people and the French people who contributed much to the development of Orientalism. And now, so what is the Orient now? So the Orient is Europe's greatest and the richest and the oldest colonies. It is the source of civilizations and languages. And it is cultural contestant and its deepest and most recurring image of the other. That's it. So the Orient is the richest, the oldest, and the greatest of the European colonies. So they came to the Orient, and their sole aim was to conquer the Oriental, to conquer the Orient. So they came to the Orient, and they became successful in, establishing their colonies in Asia. And so it is the oldest colonies, and it is its source of civilizations. Source of civilizations, because the Eastern people, the Oriental is also the source of civilizations. Great civilizations of the world developed in the Orient, like the Indus Valley civilization, the Egyptian civilization, and the like. All these things developed in the East. And again, the Orient has been considered as the cultural contestant to the Occident. So that means they think that theirs is a very vibrant culture, and the only serious the contestant to that position is the Orient. And they had so many such notions about the Oriental. So that was why when the colonizers came to our country, their first aim was to destroy our self-confidence. And they became very successful in doing so, because they totally, uh, uh, destroyed our confidence in our own systems. So that's why even now we always look to the West for confirmation. So that is why we do not have faith in uh, Covaxin. We always have faith in the Pfizer vaccine or in the Covishield, because these things were done in the researches were done in the West. So that's the thing. So this is actually an important colonial strategy to shatter, to destroy the self-confidence of the colonies, so that they can become successful in that uh, uh, race of civilizations. So thus it considers the East as the cultural contestant, and then it is the other of the Europeans. So that means the East is considered as the other of the East Westerner. Why? This is actually a term that occurred in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I hope you are familiar with the other in Lacan, because you might have studied Lacanian psychoanalysis in the last semester. So here, Lacan's other. So there is a difference between the self and the other. So the self is what we are, and the other is what we are not. So to speak in very simple terms, we can say that the self is what I am, and the other is what I am not. But there is another thing. What I am is also influenced by what I am not. You got it? So see, for example, according to Lacanian psychoanalysis, the self is actually a contributor of the other, because we fashion ourselves after somebody else. So my hairstyle is not my own invention. I got it from somebody else. And my dress code, or the way in which I self-fashion myself, is not actually something invented by me, but I got all these things from somebody else, who is my other. So that this is the relationship between the self and the other is very complicated indeed. But here, what the Europeans think that the East is, it's other, cultural other, what I am and what I am not. And again, the Orient is thus an integral part of European medieval civilization. And so that means they define themselves in terms of the Oriental. And Orientalism expresses and represents the culturally, that part culturally and ideologically as a mode of discourse, with supporting institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, and even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. So this Orientalism has its own supporting institutions, has its own supporting institutions like its vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines. So even we can see the influence of the East in their vocabulary. And an example is, I hope you are familiar with the word juggernaut. It's an English word, juggernaut, Juggernaut, juggernaut. And in some English tele, you can see while reporting to the cricket or sports events, they may say the Australian juggernaut in cricket, the Australian juggernaut. So why what is meant by juggernaut? So that word comes from India. That word comes from Jagannathan. Jagannathan. So juggernaut comes from the word Jagannathan, because in Orissa, there is a very famous temple, a world famous temple called Jagannatha Kshetram of Puri. Jagannatha Kshetram of Puri, which is actually the ancestral deity of the Nepal royal family. The Jagannatha of Puri. And during the colonial rule, or in the past, even today, the most important festival of the temple is uh, the Chariot Festival, that is Rathotsavam. Puriile Jagannathante Rathotsavam. And this chariot of Jagannatha is a huge structure, almost as high as a 10-story building or something like that. And it is actually pulled by thousands of people with the help of ropes attached to the chariot. And according to custom, once it starts, that means the chariot starts its course, it cannot be stopped at any cost until it reaches the temple. So this is actually what was special about the festival. And once it starts, it cannot be stopped at any cost, whatever happens, and it can be stopped only at the temple. And so in the past, several people who were mad with bhakti and the like, they sometimes threw themselves in front of the wheels of the chariot to be crushed under the wheels, because they think that it was a mode of salvation, a mode to attain salvation. അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ആളുകൾ ഈ രഥത്തിന്റെ മുമ്പിൽ ചാടി അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ പണ്ട് നടന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതിന്റെ ഉദ്ദേശം എന്ന് ചോദിച്ചാൽ അവർക്ക് മോക്ഷം കിട്ടാൻ വേണ്ടിയാണെന്നാണ് അവരുടെ വിശ്വാസം. പക്ഷെ എന്ത് സംഭവിച്ചാലും ഇത് മുന്നോട്ട് പോയിക്കൊണ്ടേയിരിക്കും, രഥം ഉരുണ്ടുകൊണ്ടേയിരിക്കും. And because of that, the word developed juggernaut, which means that cannot be arrested or that cannot be stopped. So this word occurs in the Oxford English Dictionary. So this Orientalism has its own supporting vocabularies, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, and the like, and even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. And then, but in contrast, the American understanding of the Orient will seem considerably less dense. The American understanding of the Orient is not that much dense. So that means it is quite, it is not that much, powerful as that of the Europeans. And now we shall see three definitions of Orientalism. Three definitions of Orientalism. The first is Orientalism as an academic discipline. That is the first definition of Orientalism. Orientalism as an academic discipline. And so Orientalism can be considered as an academic discipline. That means anyone who teaches, writes about, researches the Orient can be considered as an Orientalist. So that means an anthropologist, a sociologist, a historian, a philologist working on Orientals can be considered as Orientalists. So that means it is an academic discipline, can be considered as an academic discipline. And then it is a less preferred by specialists today, because it is too vague and general, because it cannot connotes the high-handed executive attitude of the 19th century and early 20th century European colonialism. So now it is a less sought after area. And so we can see that this is the first definition of Orientalism, that Orientalism is an academic discipline. Anyone who indulges in a study of the Oriental, an anthropologist, a sociologist, a historian, or a philologist can be considered as an Orientalist. That is the first definition of Orientalism. And now the second definition of Orientalism is that it is a style. Orientalism is a style or a style of thought. Orientalism is a style of thought. So what is meant by that? So it is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. Ontological is actually something related to the study of essence. That is ontological, a philosophical inquiry into essence. And satta vijnanam എന്നാണ് നമ്മൾ അതിനെ പറ്റി പറയുന്നത്. And again, epistemological is, again, it is epistemology is the science of knowledge. So how, Orient, epistemological distinction works between the Orient and the Occident. Epistemological means related to knowledge. മലയാളത്തിൽ തന്നെ ജ്ഞാനശാസ്ത്രപരം എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. സത്താവിജ്ഞാനപരവും ജ്ഞാനശാസ്ത്രപരവുമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ഡിവൈഡ് അവിടെയുണ്ട് between the Orient and the Occident, because there are differences in the epistemological distinction of the Orient and the Occident. That means, for example, just to make it clear, in Occidental thought, everything is considered in terms of binaries, binary opposites. So binaries are fundamental to Western thoughts and philosophy. So they considered everything in terms of binaries, binary opposites. Got the point? So in Western philosophy, there are only binaries. They define everything in terms of binary opposites. And then what are binaries? Binaries, what is meant by binaries? Binary opposites. So For example, while discussing on gender, they introduced the binary opposites, masculine and the feminine. And then another binary is the God and demon. Then another binary is day and night. And so that means there is a dualism in Western metaphysics or Western philosophy. It is dualistic, based on binaries. And they conceptualize everything in terms of binaries. It's a kind of dualism. And again, what is the danger of dualism? What is the danger of dualism? So when we adopt a dualistic standpoint, the thought process will become highly rigid and narrow. Highly rigid and narrow. It becomes rigid and narrow. And besides, when you are offered two things, you are forced to accept one and reject the other. So that is the politics. So when two things are offered to us, we are actually forced to make a selection between the two. Okay. So which means when you are offered two things, good or bad, naturally you may select the good. Then day, night, God, demon, always our preference falls on one element. So these are harmless divisions indeed. But when we come to the gender question, male or female or man or woman, when these two are offered before us, the preference always falls on man. That's the thing. So this is actually how Western philosophy analyze things using binaries, because binaries force us to opt for one. But in the Eastern thought, this is not the case. That is why Eastern philosophy is more flexible. We never believe in binaries. In fact, we believe in non-dualism. We believe in non-dualism. Advaidamanu nammada vazhi. Advaidam, not dvai, but one or three. Advaidam means not two, only not two. That does not mean that one. It can be three too. So that is a highly philosophical question, and we shall, for the time being, we shall skip it. So we always believe in Advaidam. So our streams of thought are based on this Advaidam. Aham Brahmasmin, Tvam Tattvamasi can be considered as monism. ഞാൻ ബ്രഹ്മമാണെന്ന് നീയും അത് തന്നെയാണ് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ അത് മോണിസമായിട്ട് കണക്കാക്കാൻ പറ്റും. ബട്ട് ഇൻ ദ കേസ് ഓഫ് എസെൻസസ്, സത്തയുടെ കാര്യം വരുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ മൂന്ന് സത്തകളെ പറ്റി പറയാറുണ്ട്. മൂന്ന് സത്തകളെ പറ്റി നമ്മുടെ ഫിലോസഫിയിൽ. വിചാരതെ മൂന്ന് സത്തകൾ: പുരുഷത്വം, നാരിത്വം, ക്ലീബത്വം. പുരുഷത്വം, നാരിത്വം, ക്ലീബത്വം. Whereas in the West, there are only two, masculine and the feminine. നമ്മുടെ കേസിൽ വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കിന് എസെൻസ് തന്നെ മൂന്നെണ്ണം ഉണ്ട്: പുരുഷത്വം, നാരിത്വം, ക്ലീബത്വം. പുരുഷത്വം is masculinity, നാരിത്വം is femininity, and ക്ലീബത്വം is, what is ക്ലീബത്വം? The in-betweenness, the androgyne, the in-betweenness. And we always reserve a place, a space for that too, for in-betweenness. Yes, as Meera has said, Nabumsagatva. And also we can see a lot of such characters in our mythology. Shikhandi, an example. Brihannala, so another example. So thus, there has always been a place for the third gender in our philosophy or in our mythology. The transgender now finds a place in Western metaphysics only recently. You got it? So that means the Western mode of thinking is completely different from our mode of thinking. So we are more flexible. Western religions are also highly rigid in their structure, where Eastern religions are flexible. ഈ ശ്രീരാമകൃഷ്ണ പരമഹംസരടുത്ത് പണ്ട് ഒരു ഫോറിനർ വന്നിട്ട് ചോദിക്കുന്നു, നിങ്ങൾ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ ബഹുദൈവ ആരാധന നടത്തുന്ന ആളുകളാണ്, നിങ്ങൾ ഹിന്ദുക്കൾക്ക് ഏതാണ്ട് 30 ദേവന്മാരുണ്ട്, ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് ഒരു ദൈവമേ ഉള്ളൂ, നിങ്ങൾ ഈ 30 ദേവന്മാരെയും കൊണ്ട് എങ്ങനെ ജീവിക്കുന്നു എന്നാണ് ചോദിച്ചു. അപ്പൊ പരമഹംസര് പറഞ്ഞ മറുപടി എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ, 2 തരം തൊപ്പികൾ വിൽക്കുന്ന കടകൾ, 2 കടകളുണ്ട്, 2 കടകളിലെയും തൊപ്പികളാണ് വിൽക്കുന്നത്. ഒരു കടയിലെ ഒരു സൈസിലുള്ള തൊപ്പി മാത്രമേ ഉള്ളൂ, മറ്റേ കടയിൽ പലതരത്തിലുള്ള തൊപ്പികൾ, പല സൈസിലുള്ള തൊപ്പികളുണ്ട്. നിങ്ങൾ ആദ്യത്തെ കടയിൽ പോയി തൊപ്പി വാങ്ങിക്കുവാണെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങളുടെ തലയടിച്ച് പരത്തി അതിനകത്ത് കയറ്റി വെക്കണം. രണ്ടാമത്തെ കടയിൽ ചെല്ലുവാണെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഇഷ്ടമുള്ള തൊപ്പി എടുത്ത് തല വെച്ച് നടക്കാം. സോ ദിസ് ഈസ് ദ ഡിഫറൻസ് ബിറ്റ്വീൻ ഈസ്റ്റേൺ റിലിജിയൻ ആൻഡ് വെസ്റ്റേൺ റിലിജിയൻ എന്നാണ് പരമഹംസർ പറയുന്നത്. കാരണം ദൈവം എന്ന് പറയുന്നതിനെ നമ്മൾ പല രീതിയിൽ പല മനുഷ്യരും കാണാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നു. എനിക്ക് ചിലപ്പം ഒരു അഫെക്ഷണേറ്റ് മദർ ആയിട്ടാണ് ദൈവത്തെ കാണണമെങ്കിൽ എനിക്ക് അങ്ങനെ കാണാം. അതല്ല, ഒരു അഫെക്ഷണേറ്റ് ഫാദർ ആണ് എൻ്റെ ദൈവമെങ്കിൽ അങ്ങനെ കാണാം. അതല്ല, ഒരു ടെറിബിൾ മദർ ആണ് എൻ്റെ ദൈവമെങ്കിൽ എനിക്ക് അങ്ങനെ കാണാം. അല്ല, ദൈവത്തെ ഒരു കുഞ്ഞായിട്ട് കാണാനാണ് എനിക്ക് അതിനുള്ള ഓപ്ഷൻ ഉണ്ട്. ഇതൊക്കെ ദേവതാ സങ്കല്പങ്ങൾ മാത്രമാണ്, ദൈവമൊന്നുമല്ല. അതിലൂടെ ദൈവത്തിലെത്താം എന്നുള്ളൊരു ഓഫർ മാത്രമേ കൊടുക്കുന്നുള്ളൂ. സോ ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വൈ ഈസ്റ്റേൺ റിലിജിയൻ ഈസ് മോർ ഫ്ലെക്സിബിൾ ഇൻ ദിയർ ആറ്റിറ്റ്യൂഡ്. വെട്ടൊന്ന് മുറി രണ്ടെന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു വഴി നമ്മുടേതല്ല. സോ ദാറ്റ് മീൻസ് ദർ ഈസ് ദിസ് ഫണ്ടമെന്റൽ ഡിഫറൻസ് ബിറ്റ്വീൻ വെസ്റ്റേൺ തോട്ട്സ് ആൻഡ് ഈസ്റ്റേൺ തോട്ട്. ആൻഡ് ഓൾസോ a large number of writers like novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, imperial administrators, so they have accepted the distinction between the East and the West. East and the West as a starting point of elaborate theories. And then even, modern linguistic research has started from, the Indo-European family of languages, that is especially from Sanskrit. And the father of modern linguistics is Ferdinand de Saussure. And it was he who started all these things. And he, his book, A Course in General Linguistics, was perhaps a turning point in the intellectual history of the human race, because it was not merely a book in linguistics. In fact, it was not written by Saussure. That's the thing. He had not written any book in his life. So it was actually a book compiled by his students from their lecture notes, Charles Bailey and Albert Sashahia, and they compiled their lecture notes. Saussure students had Saussure class lecture notes compare publish the book on A Course in General Linguistics, and that was in 1916, and Saussure died in 1913. So the book was published after his death. That was in 1916, 16. And the importance of the book was that the methodology adopted by Saussure was later adopted by so many other important figures in theory. For example, Lévi-Strauss adopted that the same methodology in his analysis of anthropological data. Then Derrida, Foucault, and all those post-structuralist philosophers have adopted the same methodology in their discussions, philosophical discussions. But still later, Jacques Lacan adopted the same methodology in his analysis of the human mind. So he was a positive Freudian psychiatrist, and he adopted Saussurean methodology in his analysis of the human mind. So that is the significance of the book. But who was this Saussure, and what did he teach at the University of Geneva? Saussure was a Sanskrit professor. He was a Sanskrit expert, and he even created a Sanskrit chair in the University of Geneva. And his doctoral thesis was on the Vibhakti Pratyayas of Sanskrit. So thus, the Orient was also a source of knowledge to them. And thus, so Orientalism can be considered as a style of thought, a style of thought. And that is a second definition of Orientalism. And now the third definition of Orientalism is that it is a corporate institution. Orientalism has become a corporate institution. So that means it is a corporate institution dealing with the Orient. A corporate institution dealing with the Orient. That is a style of Western dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. How this definition of Orientalism considers how the Orient is dominated, restructured, and reconfigured by the Westerners. Reconfigured by the Westerners. So here we can see that the influence of Michel Foucault, the post-structuralist philosopher Michel Foucault. I think you are familiar with the Foucault's theories. Foucault's concept of discourse. What is discourse according to Foucault? നിങ്ങളത് പഠിച്ചതാണെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു. നിങ്ങൾക്കുണ്ടല്ലോ ഒരു ടോപ്പിക് ഉണ്ടല്ലോ, പഠിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടാവുന്നു. So what is discourse? Okay, hope you are listening to me. Yes. Discourse is Vyavaharam. Yes, it is Vyavaharam. Okay. It is long. ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുണ്ട് മീര, അത് വിട്ടേക്ക്. So what is discourse? Discourse is, can be defined in different ways. Discourse can be defined in different ways. It's a very complicated term. Usually it means language. It means language. But discourse, Foucault himself defined discourse differently in different occasions, on different occasions. So for example, once he said, a discourse on blindness. A discourse on blindness contains not only the experiences of the blind, but also the experiences of the ophthalmologist who treats the blind, or a person who assists the blind, and the like. So those elements of languages, when put together, can be considered as a discourse on blindness. So that means the discourse is multi-dimensional. It is multi-sided and the like. But another possible definition of discourse is that it is a kind of invisible force working in the society. An invisible force that channelizes our thoughts, feelings, and the like. So that means though we are individually different, or though we belong to different religions or different ethnic groups, there are something, there is something which is common to us. So that means we are taught to think in a certain way, or we are forced to think in a certain way by some invisible forces working in the society. And that can be considered as a discourse. And discourses are subjected to change. So we cannot say that the discourse of today will be the discourse of tomorrow. Never. Because the discourses are subjected to change according to Foucault. And the discourse as exists at a particular point of time, according to Foucault, is called episteme. When there is a shift or change in those discourses, we can say that it can be considered as an epistemic shift. This is what Foucault said. Epistemic shift. So that means a change in the outlook of the people can be the result of an epistemic shift. So this is what he said in relation to madness. First, I mean, before the 18th century, the Westerners thought that madness was something divine, and at that time madness meant possessed by the divine. But after the 18th century, they began to consider dark madness as a kind of social, misbehavior or criminality. So the mad people were treated as criminals and they were put in prisons along with criminals. But in the 20th century, again, there was a shift, and they recognized that with the development of psychiatry and psychology, they recognized that madness is an illness. So now madness is considered as an illness. So these are the changing attitudes to people to the same thing. Why? These are the results of epistemic shifts, because shifts in the shifts in the discourses or change in discourses. That's why. So Orientalism itself is a kind of discourse. And again, without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment age. So we have to consider we have to consider Orientalism as a discourse. That is, it can be considered as a mode of thinking. Then only we can understand Orientalism politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, and scientifically. And then, because Orientalism and the Orient is not a free subject of action or thought. So there is a network of interest which can be considered as the Orient. The network of interest which can be considered as the Orient. It is a corporate institution dealing with the Orient. It is a style of dominating, restructuring, and reconfiguring the Orient. So this is the third definition of Orientalism. First, Orientalism as an academic discipline. Secondly, Orientalism as a style of thinking. And third, Orientalism as a corporate institution. And I hope it's clear. Yes. And now, another thing is that it is a British-French cultural enterprise. Orientalism is a British-French cultural enterprise because these two European nations contributed much to the development of Orientalism. This attitude towards the Oriental people. And then it is because of the closeness experienced with, maybe between Britain and France and the Orient. So they are geographically close to, that means Britain and France. Also, they are close to the Orient also, because both nations had colonies in India, Britain and France. And then from the beginning of the 19th century till the Second World War, France and Britain dominated the Orient and Orientalism. But after Second World War, America dominated the Orient. So in the pre-Second World War age, it was France and Britain who dominated Orientalism. And so now we have come to the end of the first part of introduction to the Orientalism, and now the second part. And now the second part begins with the statement that the Orient and the Occident are man-made. The Orient and the Occident are two constructs. They are man-made. They are two constructs. And then the Orient is an idea. The Orient is an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought. And it has a vocabulary too. And so, we need to be familiar with some, reasonable qualifications of the Orientalism. First, it would be wrong to conclude that Orientalism as an idea or a creation with no corresponding reality, because Disraeli, a British politician and writer, in his book Tancred, he said that the Oriental is a career. The Oriental is a career. And so this does not mean that the Oriental people can find, the Occidental people can find a career in the East so that they can make money. They can pursue an ambitious career in the East. That is not the meaning of the statement alone. Otherwise, on the other hand, it is a career because one can pursue an academic, one can make an academic pursuit after the Orient. One can make an academic pursuit after the Orient, that is studying the Oriental culture, studying Oriental nations and the like, and thus they can create a career. And then another thing is that Edward Said's project is not to find the correspondence between Orientalism and Orientalism and the Orient, but with the internal consistency of Orientalism. The internal consistency of Orientalism that we shall soon see. And then, secondly, ideas and histories cannot seriously be understood or studied without their force, or more precisely, their configurations of power. So that means ideas and cultures and histories cannot be understood without understanding the configurations of power. Without understanding the configurations of power. So that means every writing is again determined by a kind of power. So that is history, then philosophy, and all these things are constructed using a kind of power play, though we are not aware of it. ഇതിനകത്ത് ഒരു അധികാരത്തിന്റെ ഒരു കളി നടക്കുന്നുണ്ട് ഈ ചരിത്രത്തിന്റെ രചനയിലാണെങ്കിൽ പോലും. Because the historians are directed to make a history according to the whims and fancies of those who are in power. And then I told you this may not be political power. Can be a discursive power also. A discursive power is also there. That means, how can we say that discursive power? So, for example, in an example, C.V. Raman Pilla. C.V. Raman Pilla example, we are actually taught that King Martandavarma Maharaja was the architect of modern Travancore. Martandavarma Maharaja was the architect of Travancore. മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജാവ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ആ മഹാരാജാവിനെ അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് നമ്മുടെ മനസ്സിൽ ഇന്നൊരു വലിയ സ്ഥാനം ഉണ്ടാകാനുള്ള ഇതിന്റെ ഒരു പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കാരണം മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജാവ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കൽ ഹീറോയെ ഡച്ചുകാരെ പരാജയപ്പെടുത്തിയാളാണ്. മോഡേൺ തിരുവിതാംകൂറിന്റെ ആർക്കിടെക്റ്റ് ആണ്. നമ്മുടെ മറ്റു രാജ്യങ്ങളുമായിട്ട് കമ്പയർ ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ തിരുവിതാംകൂർ വലിയ രാജ്യം തന്നെയാണ്. തിരുവിതാംകൂറിന്റെ അതിർത്തി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് കന്യാകുമാരി മുതൽ അങ്കമാലി വരെയാണ്. അത് വലിയ രാജ്യമാണ് അന്നത്തെ കാലത്തെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ. തിരുവിതാംകൂർ മുതൽ അങ്കമാലി വരെ നീണ്ടു നിൽക്കുന്ന കന്യാകുമാരി മുതൽ അങ്കമാലി വരെ നീണ്ട ഒരു വലിയ സാമ്രാജ്യം, ഒരു വലിയൊരു രാജ്യമാണ് തിരുവിതാംകൂർ. MC റോഡിന്റെ പോക്ക് നോക്കിയാൽ മതി. തിരുവനന്തപുരത്ത് നിന്ന് ആരംഭിച്ചിട്ട് അങ്കമാലിയിൽ അവസാനിക്കുന്നത്. കാരണം അത് തിരുവിതാംകൂറിന്റെ സ്റ്റേറ്റ് ഹൈവേ ആയിരുന്നു അന്ന്. അപ്പോൾ അത് പോലെ ഈ മോഡേൺ ട്രാവൻകൂറിന്റെ ആർക്കിടെക്ട് മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജാവാണ്. പക്ഷെ മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജാവ് അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കലി ഇമ്പോർട്ടൻറ്റ് ഫിഗർ ആയിട്ട് നമ്മുടെ മനസ്സിൽ കയറാനുള്ള പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കാരണം എന്താണ്? നോട്ട് ഡെഫിനറ്റ്ലി ഹിസ്റ്ററി, ബട്ട് ദ നോവൽ മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ ബൈ സി വി രാമൻപിള്ളൈ. സി വി രാമൻപിള്ളയൊക്കെ മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മയ്ക്ക് എത്രയോ ശേഷം ജീവിച്ചിരുന്ന ആളാണ്. 19th സെഞ്ചുറിയിലൊക്കെ തുടങ്ങി ജീവിച്ചിരുന്ന ആളാണ് സി വി രാമൻപിള്ള. But several Nair historians of Trivandrum were against C V രാമൻപിള്ള. അതിന്റെ കാരണം എന്താണെന്ന് ചോദിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ സി വി മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജ വാസ് ദി കോസ് ഓഫ് ദ റൂയിൻ ഓഫ് ദി ഫ്യൂഡൽ ലോഡ്സ്. 8 വീട്ടിൽ പിള്ളമാരെ. 8 വീട്ടിൽ പിള്ളമാരെ എല്ലാവരെയും കൊലപ്പെടുത്തുക മാത്രമല്ല, അവരുടെ കുടുംബവും കുളം തോണ്ടി അവരുടെ പെണ്ണുങ്ങളെ ബാക്കി നാടുകടത്തി മറ്റു ജാതിക്കാരോടൊപ്പം ഇറക്കി വിടുകയും ഒക്കെ ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള ഒരാളാണ് മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജാവ് എന്നതുകൊണ്ട് പല നായർ ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻസിനും സി വി രാമൻപിള്ളയോട് എതിർപ്പുണ്ട്. കാരണം സി വി രാമൻപിള്ള ഒരു നായരാണല്ലോ. പക്ഷേ ആരും എതിർത്തിട്ടൊരു കാര്യമില്ല. കാരണം എന്താ? സി വി രാമൻപിള്ളയ്ക്ക് വേറെ ഓപ്ഷൻസ് ഒന്നുമില്ല. ഹി ഹാഡ് നോ അതർ ഓപ്ഷൻ ബട്ട് ടു റൈറ്റ് ദ നോവൽ ലൈക്ക് ദിസ്. എന്താ കാരണം? സി വി രാമൻപിള്ള വാസ് ആൻ എംപ്ലോയി ഓഫ് ദ കിങ്. മഹാരാജാവിന്റെ ഗവൺമെന്റ് പ്രസ്സിലെ ഒരു ജോലിക്കാരനായിരുന്നു സി വി രാമൻപിള്ള. അപ്പൊ സി വി രാമൻപിള്ള പേടിച്ചെഴുതുകയാണോ എന്ന് ചോദിച്ചാൽ അതുമല്ല. സി വി രാമൻപിള്ള എഴുതുകയാണ് പിന്നെ മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജാവ് ഒരു വില്ലനായിരുന്നു, 8 വീട്ടിൽ പിള്ളമാരെ കൊലപ്പെടുത്തി എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ടൊരു നോവൽ, അദ്ദേഹത്തെ വില്ലനായിട്ട് കാണിച്ചുകൊണ്ടൊരു നോവൽ എഴുതിയാൽ എന്ത് സംഭവിക്കും? നിങ്ങൾ പെട്ടെന്ന് പറയും അത് തന്നെ മീര പറഞ്ഞ കറക്റ്റ്, ഹെഡ് വിൽ നോട്ട് ബി ദെയർ എന്ന് വേണേൽ പറയാം. പക്ഷേ അത് മാത്രമല്ല അതിന്റെ റീസൺ. സപ്പോസ് അന്നത്തെ മഹാരാജാവ്, അദ്ദേഹം ആയില്യം തിരുനാളോ ശ്രീമൂലം തിരുനാളോ മറ്റുമാണെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു, അന്നത്തെ മഹാരാജാവ് അദ്ദേഹത്തോട് ക്ഷമിച്ചു. അതന്നെ കറക്റ്റ്, അദ്ദേഹത്തോട് ക്ഷമിച്ചു. ഒരു നോവലല്ലേ, സാരമില്ല, പൊക്കോട്ടെ, അതിനകത്തൊന്നും പ്രശ്നമില്ല എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് അന്നത്തെ മഹാരാജാവ് അദ്ദേഹത്തെ വെറുതെ വിട്ടാൽ പോലും ഈ നോവൽ ആളുകൾ വായിക്കുമോ? ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് എ തിങ്. ഒരിക്കലും വായിക്കത്തില്ല. ആ നോവൽ ഒരു വെട്ടം കാണില്ല. നാട്ടുകാർ റിജക്ട് ചെയ്യും മാർത്താണ്ഡവർമ്മ മഹാരാജാവിനെ വില്ലനായിട്ട് ചിത്രീകരിച്ച് നോവൽ എഴുതിയാൽ. ക്ലിയർ ആയില്ലേ? അവിടെ പവർ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഏത് പവറാണ്? പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ പവർ അല്ലത്, ഡിസ്കേഴ്സീവ് പവറാണ്. ബിക്കോസ് ദ പീപ്പിൾ love that king that much, so they will never be, അതൊക്കെ അവരെ അങ്ങനെ ആക്കിയെടുത്തതാണ്. അങ്ങനെയുള്ളൊരു സിറ്റുവേഷനിൽ the writer has no other option. So that was why Shakespeare killed Hamlet in the play. This is what the Marxist critics said. Shakespeare could have easily saved the life of Hamlet, but he did not do so. Why? That is a question. That is the politics. Because Hamlet killed Claudius, that is true. And Claudius is a villain, that too is true. But what is this Claudius? He is the king. And the king was killed by a man called Hamlet. And he too should be perished. അങ്ങനെ രാജാവിനെ കൊന്നിട്ട്, രാജാവില്ലെന്നായിക്കോട്ടെ, പക്ഷെ രാജാവിനെ കൊന്നിട്ട് അങ്ങനെ ഞെളിഞ്ഞ് നടക്കണ്ട എന്നുള്ള ഒരു തോട്ട് അവിടെയുണ്ട്. അത് ഷേക്സ്പിയർ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന കോർട്ടിയർ വളരെ ഭംഗിയായിട്ട് എഴുതി. ഒരുപക്ഷെ അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്തില്ലായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ എലിസബത്തിന് ഓഡിയൻസ് വുഡ് ഹാവ് റിജക്റ്റഡ് ദ പ്ലേ. That's the thing. The people won't accept that kind of an ending. Exactly. So that's the thing. So that means we cannot study culture, literature or history without considering the configurations of power. So the relationship between the Occident and the Orient is a relationship of power, of domination, of varying degrees of complex hegemony. So it is a kind of hegemony. It is quite accurately indicated in K.M. Panikkade's book, Asia and Western Dominance. K.M. Panikkade ഞാനല്ലേ, സൈദ് തന്നെയാണ്. So Asia and Western dominance. So the relationship between the Orient and the Occident is a kind of power, a power relationship. One has absolute power over the other. That's the thing. And the Occident again manipulates the Orient. That's the thing. So again, the Orient was Orientalized not only because it was discovered to be Oriental, but also because it could be made Oriental. It could be made Oriental. It could be made Oriental. Something that could be made Oriental. And so an example is Flaubert's description of the Egyptian courtesan. Flaubert's description of an Egyptian courtesan. Her name is Kushuk Hanim. This is the Egyptian courtesan, Kushuk Hanim. She was a courtesan. Kushuk Hanim is a Turkish term which means little woman. Little woman. So this woman, and appears in several works of Gustave Flaubert, the French novelist of the 19th century. Gustave Flaubert, you know Flaubert. His best known work is Madame Bovary. Madame Bovary. And so he, in some of his writings, he even described his meetings with this Egyptian courtesan, Kuchuk Hanim, and how he spent his days and nights with Kuchuk Hanim, how he, uh, had, made love to Kuchuk Hanim and the like. So she is an extremely beautiful lady. So that kind of a picture is given. That kind of a picture is given about the Orient. About the Orient. And then, uh, so, okay. The third point is that Orientalism is more particularly a valuable sign of European Atlantic power over the Orient. And it is more than a collection of lies. It is more than a collection of lies. And then it is not an airy fantasy about the Orient, but it created a body of theory and practice in which, for many generations, there has been considerable material investment. So it is a body, Orientalism is a body of theory, created body of theory and practice. And then this continued investment made Orientalism a system of knowledge about the Orient and an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. So this is actually an organized body of knowledge. For Orientalism is an organized body of knowledge, and several ages have their own investments in the creation of this body of theory and practice. So several, the creation of several prejudices, conceptions, misconceptions, and all such things about the Orient. Okay, so thus it becomes an instrument of domination over the Oriental people. Okay, now we shall have a small break, and we shall meet after 5 minutes. Okay. So, okay. Okay, so now let us come back to our discussion. Could you please share the PPT after the class? എനിക്ക് നിങ്ങളുടെ ടെലഗ്രാമുമായിട്ട് എനിക്ക് വലിയ ബന്ധമൊന്നുമില്ല, എനിക്കറിയില്ല. ഞാൻ നോക്കട്ടെ, ലാൽ സാറിനോട് ഞാൻ പറയാം. നിങ്ങളുടെ ടെലിഗ്രാം ഗ്രൂപ്പിൽ ഞാനില്ല എന്നാ എനിക്ക് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ പറ്റും. Okay. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Yes. So now, sides turns to Gramscian hegemony, that is the concept introduced by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Gramscian hegemony. What is hegemony? It's a concept introduced by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And what is hegemony? So there are two terms introduced by Antonio Gramsci: rule and hegemony. Rule and hegemony. That means power can be articulated through either rule or hegemony. So the same idea was, this concept of hegemony, more or less the same ideas can be seen in Louis Althusser's concept of power and control. Louis Althusser's concepts of power and control. I know what is rule and hegemony. Rule refers to the direct control of the people through laws, then police, military, and the like. That is the rule. But hegemony is a cultural control. Hegemony is a cultural control. That is, people willingly obey certain people or certain things or certain scriptures or certain words without any complaints or without any hesitation. It is because of hegemony. It is because of hegemony. So it is an internalized cultural control. That is what's called the hegemony. An internalized cultural control. So that means in every society there can be a dominant class. Their ideas or their perceptions and ideas are willingly accepted by other members of the society. So in any society or totalitarian or ordinary society, certain cultural forms predominate over others. Certain cultural forms predominate over others. Or in other words, certain ideas are more influential than others. So it is an internalized ideological control. That is what's called the hegemony. സാറ് ക്ലാസ്സിലേക്ക് വരുമ്പോൾ പിള്ളേരൊക്കെ എഴുന്നേറ്റ് നിൽക്കുക, സാറിനോട് ബഹുമാനം കാണിക്കുക, ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ കാണിച്ചാലും കാണിച്ചില്ലെങ്കിലും കുഴപ്പമൊന്നുമില്ല. അതിന് ലീഗലി ബൗണ്ട് ഒന്നുമല്ല ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ചെയ്യണമെന്നുള്ളത്. പക്ഷേ നമ്മൾ അത് ചെയ്യും. എന്തുകൊണ്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നു എന്ന് ചോദിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മുടെ ഉള്ളിൽ ഒരു കൾച്ചറൽ കൺട്രോൾ കിടപ്പുണ്ട്. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വൈ വി ഡു ദീസ് തിങ്സ്. അത് ആരുടെയും കമ്പൽഷന്റെ പുറത്തല്ല, നമുക്ക് സ്വയം ഇഷ്ടപ്രകാരം നമ്മൾ ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു സംഗതിയാണ്. ആൻഡ് ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വാട്ട് ഈസ് കോൾഡ് ഹെഗിമണി. ചില ആളുകളെ നമ്മൾ റെസ്പെക്ട് ചെയ്യും, ചില ആളുകളെ കാണുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ എഴുന്നേൽക്കും, തൊഴും. അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ നിയമം ഉണ്ടായിട്ടൊന്നുമല്ല, ബട്ട് ബിക്കോസ് വി ആർ taught to do so. That's the thing. And then Orientalism is actually a kind of cultural hegemony. Orientalism is a kind of cultural hegemony. What does it mean? Because of the colonial rule, people in the colonies have been taught that their masters' culture is a superior culture, definitely. Their master's culture is a superior culture, definitely. So they have been since birth, they have been taught to respect them, taught to consider them superior to themselves. So that's the thing. And this is actually a kind of cultural control. But at the same time, they ignore, I mean, the Westerners ignore what is positive or what is substantially qualitative in the Oriental people, or in the Oriental culture. So that means the Europeans had a cultural hegemony over the world. The Europeans had a cultural hegemony over the world. It is because of their political control over the world. They had a cultural hegemony over the world. Because of the colonial rule, because yes, because the Eastern countries, most of the Eastern countries were European colonies, and because of that kind of a political domination, they were able to circulate among the colonized people that theirs is a superior civilization, and these people were culturally and ethically inferior to them, and thus they circulated that idea, thus they established their cultural hegemony. And then they began to control all systems of knowledge, or what has been offered to the world as knowledge comes from the West, which does not mean that the East have no tradition of knowledge. Sometimes the Eastern countries have a better contribution to make, but at the same time those contributions are completely brushed aside, and they projected their own systems as the points of reference. This is the cultural hegemony. And because of that, even the colonized think that theirs is inferior culture, and thus they lack confidence, and thus they look to the West for confirmation. That's the thing. So there's a person called Keralallur Neelakandan Somayaji. Keralallur Neelakandan Somayaji. Have you heard that name? നിങ്ങൾ ആരെങ്കിലും കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ടോ പേര്? കേളല്ലൂർ നീലകണ്ഠൻ സോമയാജി. എനിബഡി? ആരെങ്കിലും കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ടോ ആ പേര്? കേളല്ലൂർ നീലകണ്ഠൻ സോമയാജി. And he lived some 500 years ago. in Tirur, Namade, Malapra Tirur. He lived some 500 years ago. He can be considered, but we are familiar with the name Pythagoras. And we haven't heard this name, that is the European hegemony. That is what is called European hegemony. This person has all the merit to be called the father of trigonometry. Trigonometry, we can അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ mathematical തിയറംസിനെ പറ്റിയുള്ള റിസർച്ച് ഇപ്പോൾ ജർമ്മനിയിൽ നടന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. ജർമ്മൻകാരാണ് ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരാളിനെ നമുക്ക് പരിചയപ്പെടുത്തുന്നത്. ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരാൾ ഇവിടെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു എന്ന് പറയും. കേളല്ലൂർ നീലകണ്ഠൻ സോമയാജി. So why? Because we have been taught to consider the West as the standard norm. We have never looked at our own systems of knowledge for reference. That's the thing. അവരെ കൊണ്ട് ഒട്ടും മോശക്കാരല്ലാത്ത ആളുകളാണ് നമ്മൾ. പക്ഷെ നമുക്ക് അതിനുള്ള കോൺഫിഡൻസ് കിട്ടാതായി പോയി. That's the thing. 1 minute. Okay. So, so it's all because of what is called the European cultural hegemony. ഒരു കൊളോണിയൽ സ്ട്രാറ്റജിയാണ്. നമ്മളിൽ നമുക്കുള്ള വിശ്വാസത്തെ തകർത്തു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ പിന്നെ വളരെ ഈസി ആയിട്ട് അവരുടെ കൾച്ചറൽ ഡോമിനേഷനിലേക്ക് എത്തിക്കാനായിട്ട് നമുക്ക് പറ്റും, അവർക്ക് പറ്റും. സോ ദാറ്റ്സ് വാട്ട്സ് കോൾഡ് ഗ്രാംഷിയൻ ഹെഗമണി. And then it depends on, Orientalism depends on a positional superiority. Positional superiority means they are positionally superior to us. The Westerners are positionally superior to us. And then the scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, the soldier. That's the Orient, because he could be there. So all these people, the scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, the soldier, they are all these things, all these people. And so thus they produce the knowledge about the Orient. They produce the knowledge about the Orient. That's the thing. And so that means the Orient became a suitable topic for study, a study in the academy. It can be displayed in a museum. So it can be displayed in a museum so that they can come and see them. And then a lot of writings like Sylvester D. Sassi's Christomathy Arab or Edward William Lane's account of manners and customs of modern Egyptians influenced Western imagination. So all these writings influenced Western imagination of the East. And there is even a pornographic novel in Victorian England, The Lustful Turk. The Lustful Turk. So this is how they produce the knowledge about the Orient. And now the third part of the essay. Here, Edward Said said that he has two fields, that is distortion and inaccuracy. Distortion and inaccuracy. So that means the picture of the West can be distorted and the inaccuracy can be there. ഒരു എക്സാമ്പിൾ പറയാം. അത് എൻ്റെ ഗൈഡ്, PhD ഗൈഡ് ഡോക്ടർ ജാൻസി ജെയിംസ് ആയിരുന്നു ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂട്ടിൽ. ടീച്ചർ പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു സംഭവമാണ്. ടീച്ചർ സെൻട്രൽ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റി വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ ആയി നിന്നപ്പോൾ ഒരു കോൺഫറൻസിന് പോയി, ഒരു ഇന്റർനാഷണൽ കോൺഫറൻസ് യൂറോപ്പിലാണ്, ഏതോ ഒരു യൂറോപ്യൻ കൺട്രിയിൽ വൈസ് ചാൻസലേഴ്സിന്റെ കോൺഫറൻസ് ആണ്. അപ്പോ വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ ലോകത്തിന്റെ പല ഭാഗത്തു നിന്നുള്ള വൈസ് ചാൻസലർമാരോട് വന്നു. അതിലെ ഒരു വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ, ഏതോ ഒരു യൂറോപ്യൻ രാജ്യത്തെ വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ ടീച്ചറിനെ പരിചയപ്പെട്ടിട്ട് ചോദിച്ച ചോദ്യമുണ്ട്, മാഡം, ഡു യു ലിവ് ഇൻ എ താച്ച്ഡ് ഹൗസ്? ഡു യു ലിവ് ഇൻ എ താച്ച്ഡ് ഹൗസ് എന്നാണ് ചോദിച്ചത്. അങ്ങനെ അവർ വിചാരിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നത്. ചോദിച്ച ആളൊരു വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ, ചോദ്യം കേട്ട ആൾ ഒരു വൈസ് ചാൻസലർ ആണെന്ന് ഓർക്കണം. അപ്പൊ അവരുടെയൊക്കെ വിചാരം നമ്മുടെ വൈസ് ചാൻസലർമാർ വരെ ഇതുപോലെ എന്നാണ് ഓല മേഞ്ഞ താമസിക്കുന്നു എന്നുള്ളതായിരിക്കും. സോ ദിസ് ഈസ് ഹൗ this kind of a distorted, inaccurate picture of the Orient is circulated among the Europeans. And then he said that while trying to deal with all these problems, he had to consider three main aspects. Said has to consider three main aspects. Three main aspects. The first is, yes, Mira, the distinction between pure and political knowledge. First, we have to be familiar with the distinction between pure and political knowledge. Pure and political knowledge. What is pure knowledge and what is political knowledge? So there is a common feeling that true knowledge is fundamentally non-political. So this is a general feeling. True knowledge or pure knowledge is political, fundamentally political. Sorry, non-political. Sorry, non-political. Fundamentally non-political. For example, knowledge about Shakespeare or knowledge about Wordsworth can be considered as pure knowledge because they are untouched by politics. Whereas a knowledge about contemporary China or the Soviet Union is political. So that means one is non-political and the other is political. So that means a humanist and ordinary persons. So the difference between them is that the first think that there is no politics in pure knowledge. The first thing that there is no politics in pure knowledge. And the second person, I mean, an ordinary person thinks that there is politics in the discussions of economics, politics, and sociology of modern states. And now that means there is a distinction between politics and non-politics, political knowledge and non-political knowledge. So that means there can be two sorts of knowledge about the Orient: pure knowledge and political knowledge. Pure knowledge and political knowledge. Pure knowledge in the sense novels and stories about the Orient, or researches conducted on the Orient, Oriental systems. They can be pure knowledge. But when we discuss the Oriental people in comparison with the Occidental, or when we discuss the brutal politics, political, economic, and military power used in the Oriental, we can say that it is political knowledge. But things are not that simple, because the main idea is that we cannot distinguish between political knowledge and non-political knowledge, because every knowledge is political. Because every knowledge is political, but in different degrees. Every knowledge is political, but in different degrees. Okay, every knowledge is political, but in different degrees. So we cannot escape from politics, because if each one of us has his own politics, our own politics, which means the moment we open our mouths to say something, that is our politics, our own ideological preferences. We are all ideologically conditioned. We all have our own personal ideologies. This does not mean that we are a communist or we are a right-wing activist or something like that. That is not politics. All of us have our own personal ideologies, and we are all conditioned by our own personal priorities and difference, preferences. So that is our politics. But the so-called pure knowledge or non-political knowledge pretends to be pure, but at the same time, they have their own underlying politics. They have their own underlying politics. So take the case of Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness is a novel about Africa, about Congo, about Africa. So we may feel that there is nothing wrong about the novel. It is a fiction. It is a matter of pure knowledge and the like. But no, it is never a system of pure knowledge. There is a kind of politics. How he portrays Africa is the politics behind the story, behind the novel. There is a politics even behind the title of the novel, Heart of Darkness. There is a politics even behind the title of the novel. What is Heart of Darkness? Africa. Africa is the heart of darkness. So that is why, as I told you in the last class, HB said that darkness is not in Africa, but in the heart of the Europeans. So that means we cannot say that there is a pure academic knowledge. All knowledge is political, and all theorizations and conceptualizations of Orient is again informed by, or they are all informed by what? An underlying politics, and politics which was in favor of the Westerners. Yes. And then, right, man. And Orientalism is not merely a political subject matter or something reflected passively by culture. It is part of a Western plot. Orientalism is part of a Western plot to subdue the East. It is part of a Western plot to subdue the East. First, that a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philological text. First, it is a distribution of awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic. So these forms of knowledge about the Orient are produced. Aesthetic knowledge about the Orient, scholarly knowledge about the Orient, economic knowledge about the Orient, and so this a geopolitical awareness of these is created. So that means how the Western systems are different from the Eastern systems. So that is what is meant by geopolitical awareness. How the Western systems of aesthetics, economic, sociological, and historical or philological systems are different from those of the West East. And secondly, an elaboration of not only of the basic geographical distinction, but also of a series of multidisciplinary interests. And this is not merely a geographical distinction. So that means the difference between the Orient and the Occident is not merely a difference between two geographical locations, but it is also a difference between culture, a difference between culture, a difference between civilization, a difference between systems of knowledge and the like. So that means this is not an innocent distinction between two areas, two lands. It is an intention to understand or control a very different world through different kinds of political, intellectual, cultural, or moral power. So Orientalism is thus, the intention of Orientalism is thus to control a different world, to control a different world through various kinds of power. That is political, intellectual, cultural, moral, economic power. ഈ തരം പവറിലൂടെ എങ്ങനെ ഓറിയന്റിനെ വരുതിയിലാക്കാം, കൺട്രോളിൽ നിർത്താം എന്നുള്ളതിനെ പറ്റിയുള്ള ഒരു ബോഡി ഓഫ് തോട്ട്സ് ആണ് ഓറിയന്റലിസം. ആൻഡ് ദെൻ Orientalism is a considerable dimension of modern political intellectual culture. And so this is how Orientalism is dispersed. So that means Orientalism is actually a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, and economic. How these systems of the West are different from those of the East, and how the distinction between the East and the West works, not only in terms of geographical distinction, but also in a series of interests like a political, civilizational, cultural, and the like. And thirdly, its intention is to control a different world in every aspect. But they may say that the scholar, philosopher, and all such people are trained not in political or ideological systems. But that is not true, because all systems are political and ideological. And then 19th century writers like J.S. Mill, Arnold, then Carlyle, Newman, Macaulay, Ruskin, George Eliot, Dickens, and even Dickens, they had definite views on race and imperialism. So they had definite rules or views on race and imperialism, which are quite easily to found at work of their work. So these, though their works seem very innocent and very objective, but again we can see an underlying politics in the writings of all these writers. I mean, the economist J.S. Mill, Matthew Arnold, then Carlyle, Newman. So that means to believe the politics in the form of imperialism bears upon the production of literature is by no means equivalent to saying that culture is therefore a demeaned or denigrated thing. So this is how they produced the Oriental culture, in a demeaned or denigrated thing. And on the contrary, we can better understand the persistence and durability of structuring hegemonic systems like culture when we realize that their cultural constraints upon writers and thinkers are productive, not unilaterally inhibiting. So that means, so on the contrary, we can see the durability and of saturating hegemonic systems like culture. So when they produce writers and thinkers in a very productive way. So that is actually denied to the East, and that happens only in the West. So that thus we can say that we can study Orientalism as a dynamic exchange dynamic exchange between individual authors and large political concerns shaped by the three empires, British, French, and American. So thus we can say that the political questions raised by Orientalism are: first question, what other sorts of intellectual, aesthetically, and cultural energies went into the making of imperialist traditions like the Orientalist one? So what sorts of intellectual, aesthetic, scholarly, and cultural energies went into the making of an imperialist tradition like a Oriental one? So that means if Orientalism has an alternative, what is it? So that is a question. Then how did philology, lexicography, history, biology, political, and economic theory, novel writing, service of broadly imperialist view of the world? So how things, I mean, philology, lexicography, history, biology, political, and all things come to the imperialist view of the world. So, for example, we are all familiar with the Aryan superior, Aryan invasion theory. Sorry, Aryan invasion, not Aryan. An outdated thing, Even leftist, historians like Romila Thapar, even she is also silent on these issues. Iron invasion theory. The thing was that it was actually the product of Max Muller's research. So this was how they justified European colonization, because they put forward the theory that the Central Asian Aryan tribes invaded India and they settled in India. And by making that kind of a theory, that kind of a knowledge, they very safely justified their own colonization. That is Western colonization, because Max Muller was, trained, educated, and trained in British schools and British educational institutions. And he wrote that theory in support of British colonization. But modern researchers discovered that Aryans were tribes lived on the banks of river Sindhu, or the river Saraswati, and then when the Saraswati river disappeared and the terrible drought broke out in the arable lands, they went to, or they went to different corners of India. So this was what happened. This may be the, and also some theorists even believe that Aryans were there here even before that kind of a you know uh, uh, circulation of people. Okay, so anyway, whatever it is, such theories were produced for the benefit of the Europeans. And then another thing is that changes, modulations, refinements, even revolutions take place within Orientalism. So that is another question. And then how does Orientalism transmit or reproduce itself from epoch to epoch? So, and what is the meaning of originality, of continuity, or individuality in this context? So these are the questions raised uh, by Orientalism. They're raised by Orientalism. So that means Said's argument is that each humanistic investigation must formulate the nature of that connection in the specific context of the study. So all studies should be in connection with a humanistic investigation. Okay. And now the second concern of side is the methodological question. The methodological question: what methodology should be adopted? So this is definitely a point of departure. So the idea of beginning, indeed the act of beginning, involves an act of delimitation by which something is cut out of a great mass of material separated from the mass. So the first thing is that where to start. Yes. So that means where should we start the study of Orientalism? What is the starting point? What should be the starting point? And so that means here he recalled Louis Althusser's concept of the problematic, because it is always it raises several questions. Problematic arises when we have to answer several questions. When we have to answer several questions, and the answers themselves may not be satisfactory, and that situation is what is called the problematic. So in the case of Orientalism, there is not simply the problem of finding a point of departure, but also the question of designating which texts, authors, and periods are the ones best suited for study. So another problem with methodological problem with the study of Orientalism is which texts or authors and periods should be considered as suitable for the study of Orientalism. That is another question. Who can be considered as Oriental writers? Writers of Orientalism. And then he elaborated his reasons for not attempting narrative history of Orientalism. So it is very difficult to form a narrative history of Orientalism, because Orientalism is basically a European narrative. Orientalism is basically a European narrative. So that is the main, reason. And secondly, the narrative model itself is not suitable to describe political interest. What is narrative method? Just like telling a story, a chronological telling of the story. Orientalism എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഒരു കഥ പറയുന്നത് പോലെ പറയാൻ പറ്റുന്ന ഒരു സംഗതിയല്ല, because that model is not suitable to discuss political interest, descriptive or political interest. And thirdly, because there are such books as Raymond Schwab's La Renaissance Oriental, Johann Fuchs, De Arbeiten Studien in Europa bis bin Anfang des Jahrhunderts, and more recently, Dorothy Melzi's The Matter of Arabic in Medieval England. So these books are definitely different from European Orientalism. These books are definitely different from European Orientalism. They do not belong to that concept of European Orientalism. So that is why it is quite difficult for us to start a narrative history of Orientalism. And it is, as we have already seen, it is a British-French-American enterprise. And then a lot of such traits can be seen even in literature, like Mr. Casaubon in Middlemarch. So then, in Middlemarch, I think you have studied Middlemarch in your first semester. And in all these literary works, we can see their own concepts about the Oriental people, how the Orient is, and because all these novels were written in the colonial context. And then the German Orient. But the German Orient was exclusively scholarly, because the Germans were interested in the knowledge systems of the East. They were interested in the knowledge systems of the East, and so they even started an institution to study India, Indian culture, Indian philosophy, and the like. That is the Institute of Indology. And then the German writers like Goethe and Friedrich Schlegel, Goethe and Friedrich Schlegel also referred to the Orient in their works. And then another problem is the question of authority. What is authority in this regard? That means the intellectual authority over the Orient. So that is what's called authority here. The intellectual authority here. So what German Orientalism had in common with Anglo-French American Orientalism was a kind of intellectual authority over the Orient within Western culture. So that authority must in large part be the subject of any discussion of Orientalism. So that means that is the common link between Anglo-American, Anglo-French American Orientalism and German Orientalism. That is the kind of intellectual authority over the Orient. Even the Germans also tried to establish a kind of intellectual authority over the Orient. So they studied Oriental texts. And now, the methodological devices for studying authority can be called strategic location and the strategic formations. So these two terms are important: strategic location and strategic formation. So that means when we begin to study Orientalism, we have to be cautious of two methodological devices, that is strategic location and strategic formation. So what is strategic location? First, the writer, anyone who writes about the Orient should be strategically located. So that means a person who wishes to write about the Orient must locate himself with regard to the Orient. So that means he should be somehow related to the Orient. That is his strategic location. The kinds of images, themes, motives that circulate in that, all of which add to the deliberate ways of addressing the reader, containing the Orient, and finally representing it, speaking in its behalf. So that is a strategic location to be adopted in writing about the Orient. So the same question can be raised in connection with Dalit literature. Dalit literature. What is Dalit literature? ഞാനത് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി പറയുന്നേ ഉള്ളൂ, ഇതുമായിട്ട് ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടുള്ളതല്ല. ദളിത് ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കിന് എ ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ അബൌട്ട് ദ ദളിത് എന്നാണ് ഡെഫിനിഷൻ കൊടുക്കുന്നതെങ്കിൽ തകഴി ശിവശങ്കരപ്പിള്ള ഈസ് എ ദളിത് റൈറ്റർ, ബിക്കോസ് ഹി ഹാഡ് പോർട്രേഡ് the lives of the Dalits in his writings, in his novels. അവരുടെ പതറ്റിക് ലൈഫിനെ വളരെ ഭംഗിയായിട്ട് ഡിസ്കസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള ഒരാളാണ് തകഴി ശിവശങ്കരപ്പിള്ള. But the Dalit theorists are not actually ready to accept him as a Dalit writer because he is strategically not located within Dalit culture. Yes, that's the thing. He is not a Dalit because, and then we have to define Dalit literature as the literature written by the Dalits. A literature written by the Dalits. And so that means that naturally this is the problematic. What is Dalit literature? Is it the literature about the Dalits or is it literature by the Dalits? So when it is a literature by the Dalits, we can say that he is strategically located because he is speaking on behalf of that particular section of the society, or he is strategically located within that particular system. So that's the thing. So that is strategic location, because anyone who wishes to write about the Orient should be strategically located because only he could represent or speak on behalf of the Orient. So that is a strategic location. That is what's meant by strategic location. And then the second one is strategic formation. What is strategic formation? Every writer on the Orient assume some Oriental precedent, some previous knowledge of the Orient, to which he refers and on which he relies. Additionally, each work on the Orient affiliates itself with other works, with audiences, with institutions, and the Orient itself. So that is another important thing. The strategic formation. So that means when we begin to write about the Orient, when we decide to write about the Orient, the first thing is that we should find our strategic formation. So that means what are the books that we can rely on? What are the books that we can rely on? What are the previous systems of knowledge that we can adopt in these writings? So that's very important. നമ്മൾ ആരുടെയൊക്കെ മോഡലുകൾ ഉപയോഗിച്ചാണ് നമ്മൾ ഇനി എഴുതാൻ പോകുന്നത്. And that is what is called a strategic formations. So these two are very important: strategic location and strategic formation. And now another point he discussed is the exteriority. What is called exteriority? That is, this is his own words. My concern with authority does not, these are his own words. My concern with authority does not entail analysis of what lies hidden in the Orientalist text, but analysis rather of the text surface, its exteriority to what it describes. So that means his concern is with the exteriority of the text, its surface of the text, its exteriority, and then the principal product of this exteriority is a course of representation. Or as early Aeschylus play the Persians, the Orient is transformed into a very far distant and often threatening otherness. So that means in Aeschylus play, the Persians, the Orient is transformed into a far distant and threatening otherness. And so the exteriority refers to the representation of the Orient. So that is what he is concerned about. The representation of the Orient, that is what is called the exteriority of the text. That is important. And his third concern is the personal dimension. The personal dimension. So in contemporary electronic postmodern world, there has been a reinforcement of the stereotypes of the Orient. A reinforcement of the stereotypes of the Orient. So that is through TV, films, and they have actually further demonized the mysterious Orient. And then history of popular anti-Arab and anti-Muslim prejudice in the West. That is another thing. Then the struggle between Arabs and Israeli Zionism and its effect on liberal culture. Then the total absence of cultural position which enables identification with or dispassionate analysis of Arabs or Islam. So all these have to be considered in the contemporary postmodern world, because we are living in a postmodern world where the electronic media predominates. And the electronic media generates or reinforces a series of stereotypes of the Orient through television events, even films and the like. So a lot of Hollywood films are there depicting the life of the Orientals, the Arabs, the Egyptians and the like. ഇഷ്ടംപോലെ അങ്ങനത്തെ സിനിമകൾ നമുക്ക് കാണാനായിട്ട് സാധിക്കും. And they actually today they reinforce the same stereotypes of the Orient as expressed in the past. So these are the three concerns raised by Edward Said. So there ends our introduction to Orientalism. And now, if you have doubts, we can discuss now. Okay, I'll be happy to hear from you. Please write your comments on the or questions on the chat box. Each and every human knowingly or unknowingly influence others. Okay, so Media, are you? Stereo. Yeah, absolutely right. The Europeans and their colonies. So exteriority refers to the representation of the Orient uh, in the text. So how the Orient is represented in the text. A lot of novels are there written about India and the Orient by the Westerners. So how E.M. Foster's passage to India, and how these texts again represents the Orient is actually what is called the exteriority of the text. Okay, so that means um, uh, definitely there is an interiority which lies dormant or inherent within the text. But when we read a novel, our first experience is with the characters and their actions, and that is what is called the exteriority of that text. And then personal dimensions are there because we are living in a postmodern contemporary electronic world dominated by the electronic media. So naturally, our conceptions and our attitudes are influenced by the electronic media. So naturally, the stereotypes of the Orient are also reinforced by the same electronic media. So these things help to develop anti-Arab and anti-Muslim prejudice in the East. And then the struggle between Arabs and Israel uh, uh, has another impact on liberal culture. So then the cultural positions and all these things are reinforced by modern electronic media. That's it. Archana, are you okay? Arabs and Islam എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അതൊരു വല്ലാത്ത ചോദ്യമായല്ലോ മീരെ. അറബ്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു റേസ് ആണ്, ഇസ്ലാം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു മതവുമാണ്. ഇസ്ലാം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു റിലിജിയനും അറബ്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഒരു റേസുമാണ്. ഇസ്ലാമിന് മുമ്പ് അറബ്സ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഇസ്ലാം ഉണ്ടായത് ഒരു 8-ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിലൊക്കെയാണ്. അപ്പൊ അതിനു മുമ്പ് അറബ് റേസ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. പേർഷ്യൻസ്, അറബ്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന അറബ് റേസ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഇസ്ലാം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അതിന് ശേഷം വന്നൊരു മതം മാത്രമാണ്. മറ്റേതെന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അറബ്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഒരു റേസ് ആണ്. അവരുടേതായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രത്യേക ജീവിത ശൈലികളുള്ള ഒരു റേസ് ആണ് അറബ്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. അല്ല, അറബ്സിനകത്ത് തന്നെ വേറെ ഒത്തിരി സ്ട്രീംസ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഇസ്ലാമാണ് ഡോമിനേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിലും അറബ്സിനിടയിൽ വേറെ അധികം കേട്ടിട്ടില്ലാത്ത സ്ട്രീംസ് വേറെ ഒത്തിരി ഉണ്ട്. പക്ഷെ കണ്ടംപററി വേൾഡിൽ നമ്മൾ കൂടുതൽ അറബ്സ് എന്ന് റെഫർ ചെയ്യുന്നത് പെട്ടെന്ന് എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ സൗദി അറേബ്യ ഉൾപ്പെടെയുള്ള സ്ഥലങ്ങളിൽ മുസ്ലിം ഇസ്ലാം മെജോറിറ്റി ആയതുകൊണ്ട് നമ്മൾ പെട്ടെന്ന് അറബ് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് മുസ്ലിം എന്നുള്ളൊരു മനസ്സിൽ കടന്നു വരും. പക്ഷെ നമ്മൾ തന്നെ ഒരു ഡിഫറൻസ് ആലോചിക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ദിസ് ഇസ് ദ ഡിഫറൻസ്. Okay, what else? Pure knowledge and political knowledge. Yeah, pure knowledge means there is no pure knowledge. That is actually what he tries to say. Pure knowledge ഒരു knowledge ഇല്ലെന്ന് തന്നെയാണ് പറയുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ നമ്മൾ പറയുമ്പോൾ എല്ലാവരും പറയും പ്യുവർ നോളജ്, പ്യുവർ നോളജ്. നമ്മൾ പഠിക്കുന്ന പ്യുവർ നോളജ് ആണ്, സാഹിത്യം മുഴുവനും പ്യുവർ നോളജ് ആണ് എന്നൊക്കെ പറയും. പക്ഷെ അങ്ങനെ നോളജ് ഇല്ലെന്നുള്ളതാണ് എന്റെ വാസ്തവം. ബിക്കോസ് ഓൾ നോളജ് ആർ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ്, പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ നോളജ്. അതിനകത്തെല്ലാം പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് ഉണ്ട്. നമ്മളിപ്പം എന്ത് പഠിക്കണം എന്ന് തീരുമാനിക്കുന്നത് ആരാണ്? യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയാണ്. യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റി നമുക്ക് സിലബസ് ചെയ്യുന്നതിനകത്ത് പോലും ഒരു പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അതിന്റെ അർത്ഥം ഈ എന്തെഴുതുന്നതിനകത്തും ഒരു പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പൊ അതിന്റെ അർത്ഥം നമ്മളെ എല്ലാം പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ പാർട്ടീസിൽ ഉൾപ്പെടുന്നു എന്നല്ല അതിന്റെ അർത്ഥം. നമ്മളുടെ അഭിപ്രായങ്ങൾ, നമ്മളെല്ലാവരും എന്താണ് പറയുന്നത്, യന്ത്രങ്ങളല്ലല്ലോ. നമുക്ക് എല്ലാവരുടെയും നമ്മുടെ മനസ്സിൽ ഒരു ശരി ഏതാ തെറ്റേതാന്ന് ഒരു ഐഡിയോളജിക്കൽ പ്രിഫറൻസ് നമുക്കുണ്ട്. അത് വെച്ചാണ് നമ്മൾ എഴുതുന്നത്. ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻസ് എഴുതുമ്പോഴും അത് തന്നെ അവർ എഴുതുന്നത്. അവരുടെ ഐഡിയോളജിക്കൽ പ്രിഫറൻസ് ആണ് ഹിസ്റ്റോറി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. അല്ലാതെ ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയാണ്, അല്ലാതെ അത് സത്യമൊന്നുമല്ല. ഹിസ്റ്റോറി ഓരോരുത്തർ അവരുടെ തരത്തിലുള്ള സ്റ്റോറി ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നതേ. റിവോൾട്ട് ഓഫ് 1857, ഫോർ എക്സാമ്പിൾ, was described as a sepoys mutiny by British historians. But Indian historians hailed it as the first war of independence, which is true. ഇടയ്ക്കെവിടെയോ ആണ് സത്യം. അപ്പൊ അതേപോലെ പ്യുവർ നോളജ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് നോൺ പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ നോളജ് ആണെന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. ബാക്കിയെല്ലാം പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ നോളജ്. പക്ഷെ പ്യുവർ നോളജ് ഈസ് ഇമ്പോസിബിൾ ബിക്കോസ് എവറി നോളജ് ഈസ് പൊളിറ്റിക്കലി കണ്ടീഷൻഡ്. അതുകൊണ്ട് നമ്മൾ പ്യുവർ നോളജ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നവർ ചെയ്യുന്നത് ഒരുതരം ഹിപ്പോക്രസിയാണ്. ദേ ട്രൈ ടു ഹൈഡ് ദെയർ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് ബിഹൈൻഡ് ദ സ്ക്രീൻ ഓഫ് ഒബ്ജക്ടിവിറ്റി. ദാറ്റ്സ് ദ തിങ്. Is it clear now? Meera, Archana, Hazar, your way of teaching is good and understand. According to me, when you explain terms with your own examples, help me to understand well. So my kind suggestion is to explain the literary terms and with more simple examples. Archana, thank you. പക്ഷെ എന്ത് ലിറ്റററി ടേംസ് ആണ് എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻ ചെയ്യേണ്ടത്? The literary terms with more and simple examples. So like my first explain the literary terms and more. എല്ലാം ഞാൻ കുറച്ചൊക്കെ എക്സാമ്പിൾസ് ഉപയോഗിച്ചല്ലേ പറയുന്നത്. നീ ഏത് ലിറ്റററി ടേം എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻ ചെയ്ത് തരണം? പറഞ്ഞതാ, ഞാൻ പറയാം. I will be happy to do so. Sir, a normal conversation between two people can be political. പിന്നെന്താ സംശയം? എന്താ? നമ്മൾ രണ്ടുപേരുടെ സംസാരിക്കുകയാണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ നമ്മളുടേതായ വീക്ഷണങ്ങളും നമ്മളുടേതായിട്ടുള്ള അഭിപ്രായങ്ങളും നമ്മൾ പറയാറില്ലേ? അപ്പൊ അത് പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് അല്ലേ? That can be a politics. ഈ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് എന്ന് നമ്മൾ മോഡേൺ കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ, നമ്മൾ ഈ തിയറട്ടിക്കൽ കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നത് പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ ഐഡിയോളജി അല്ല. അത് മാർക്സിസമോ BJPയോ കോൺഗ്രസോ ഒന്നും അല്ല. നമ്മൾ ഐഡിയോളജിക്കലി എങ്ങനെയാണ് കണ്ടീഷൻ ചെയ്തിരിക്കുന്നത് എന്നുള്ളതനുസരിച്ച്. അതാണ് നമ്മൾ ബേസിക്കലി നമ്മളൊരു സോഫ്റ്റ്വെയർ ആണ്. അതാണ് പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് നമ്മൾ ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത്. യെസ്. Archana, I accept your suggestion. I value your suggestion, and I'm very quite happy to hear your suggestion. Very. And thank you for your kind words and our way of thoughts and actions. Okay. അത് തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ ആറ്റിറ്റ്യൂഡാണ് നമ്മുടെ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. ഇപ്പൊ ഞാൻ ഇത്രയും നേരം നിങ്ങളോട് സംസാരിച്ചു, അപ്പൊ എന്നെ പറ്റി നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഏതാണ്ട് ഒരു ധാരണയായില്ലേ? അതാണ് എന്റെ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ്. ഞാൻ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഓരോ കാര്യങ്ങളെ വിശകലനം ചെയ്യുന്നത്, എന്നെ പറ്റി എന്തായിരിക്കും ഒരു ഐഡിയ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കിട്ടിയിട്ടില്ലേ? അതെന്തുകൊണ്ടാ? എന്റെ വായിക്കൂടെ വരുന്നതല്ല എന്റെ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ് ആയതുകൊണ്ടാണ്. ഇത്രയും നമ്മൾ 2 ക്ലാസ് എടുത്തു. 2 ക്ലാസ്സിൽ 5-5.5 മണിക്കൂർ നമ്മൾ സംസാരിച്ചു. നമ്മൾ സംസാരിക്കുമ്പോൾ എന്നിലൂടെ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് എന്നെ പറ്റി കുറെ ഐഡിയാസ് കിട്ടത്തില്ലേ? ഞാൻ ചില കാര്യങ്ങളെ പറ്റി എന്റെ അഭിപ്രായങ്ങൾ പറയാറില്ല. അപ്പൊ ഞാൻ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഉള്ള ആളാണെന്ന് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് റെഡി കിട്ടിയില്ലേ? ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് മൈ പൊളിറ്റിക്സ്. നമുക്ക് അങ്ങനെ ഒന്നും മറച്ചു വെച്ചുകൊണ്ട് സംസാരിക്കാൻ സാധിക്കുന്നില്ല. കാരണം നമ്മൾ എന്തൊക്കെ മറച്ചു വെച്ചാലും നമ്മുടെ വായിൽ നിന്ന് എന്തെങ്കിലുമൊക്കെ പുറത്തു വരും. അതാണ് സത്യം. താങ്ക് യു മിര. വെൽക്കം. Okay. Shall we wind up? Okay. Let us stop now, and we shall meet in the next class. Thank you.